Test, test. Christopher, all good? Yep, okay.
So that you feel supported.
Good morning. Welcome to our Parsha study class with the Sinai Temple Clergy. I know it says on YouTube with Rabbi Avi Taff, but I'm Rabbi Erez Sherman. Rabbi Taff is with our amazing students in our Sinai Akiba Academy, but we love sharing our Torah together. I want to share a few thoughts this morning. First of all, the Parsha is called Ki Teitzei. And Ki Teitzei is a Parsha that comes in the book of Deuteronomy, right in the heart of it. And it's interesting when you look at the different mitzvot in the Torah, the commandments in the Torah. This one has a lot of them. Over 70 commandments of the entire Torah, of the 613, are found exactly in this Parsha. It's interesting because all of these mitzvot are really not of the same genre. There are so many different mitzvot. Some relevant mitzvot, which are not usually relevant to our lives, are in fact the ethics of war. There's a beautiful new book that came out this year, unfortunately. It's based on Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, but it's called the ethics of our fighters. And it is how, as Jews, when we, God forbid, need to fight a war, how we fight that war ethically. And that is the first part of the Parsha. There's also a very well-known mitzvah called the Ben Sorer Umoreh, which is the rebellious child, famously saying, Ki yeh le'ish ben sorer umoreh einenu shomea b'kol aviv v'kol imo. If a person has a defiant son who does not listen to their mother or father and does not obey them, even after they discipline him, v'lo yishma lehem, they take him out to the community, and unfortunately they take his life. And you can say, how is that ethical? And when you look into the Talmud, in the Masechet Sanhedrin, the rabbis tell us that this never happened. that rather this mitzvah within the Torah is a warning so that it will never happen. And so it's truly important to look at, when you look at the different mitzvot, pshat and drash, the simple meaning of what the text says, and then what it should mean in our own lives. But I want to focus on a different mitzvah that comes after a very famous one, and it is ki tivnei bait chadash. When you build a new house, it says, you have to do something specifically. What is that? V'asita ma'akeh leganecha. That you should make, in English, a parapet, or we're going to call it a fence for now. It says around your garden, but it actually is on the roof. V'lo tasim damim beveitecha. You should not bring, it says, blood guilt on your house. Ki ipol hanofel mimenu, if anybody should fall off of it. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments. It's interesting that that mitzvah comes right after another very well-known mitzvah about a bird. Ki ikarei ket tzipor lefanecha, that if along the road you chance upon a bird's nest, right? In any tree or on the ground. So think about if you have a bird's nest, even built in your house or near your roof, and it has eggs in it, or a young bird, and the mother is sitting on those eggs. What is the mitzvah? Do not take the mother together with the young. Rather, let the mother go and take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. And what is the reason, the halakha l'maaseh behind that? The rabbis tell us, the compassion demanded for the mother bird here is one of the Torah's passages that led the rabbis to formulate the general principle that we must avoid causing unnecessary pain to animals. In Hebrew, tsar ba'alei chayim. So, of course, this idea of compassion and ethics, it doesn't just relate to human beings, but it even relates to animals, not just our pets, but also to animals that we just find. I also, of course, want to mark what will happen tomorrow in the world, and that is the commemoration of 9/11, September 11th. It's hard to believe that it is 23 years, 9/11, 2024, since 9/11, 2001. And each year that we mark this commemoration, as it gets further and further from that date, I look into the Torah and try to find not meaning behind that day, because there will never be meaning behind that day, but rather some type of purpose that will allow us to go forward in the days to come. And I believe that comes in this mitzvah that I want to speak about, which is when you build a house, build a fence around it so that nobody gets hurt. And it's not just the physical piece, but the mental aspect as well. Finally, I want to begin with a mitzvah that is found on chapter 22, verse 3. It says, Lo tireh et shor achicha o et seiv nidachim v'hit alamta mehem ashev teshivem al achicha. It says if you find your neighbors or your friends or a person's ox or sheep and the animal has gone astray, it says, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. We know the famous mitzvah of returning a lost object, right? If you find a diamond ring somewhere, you make sure that you don't just take it, but you find its rightful owner. And Rashi says, going further, verse 3 says that it's not only an ox or a sheep, it's not only a kosher animal, it's a non-kosher animal. If you find, you must return it. But even more so, Rashi says that even if you find somebody's clothing, you must return it. Rashi says you cannot pretend that you do not see it. That is the ethic behind returning a lost object. You cannot pretend that you do not see it. Whether it's a live animal or whether it's just simply somebody's t-shirt, you cannot pretend that you do not see it. Sforno, the Italian commentator, says, why do they mention a garment? He says, because even though you may think it is improbable that this will not happen, somebody's not just going to leave their shirt in the middle of the street, you still need to return it. In the rabbinic tradition, it's called kal v'chomer, even the more so, right? If you find somebody's animal, of course you're going to return it. But even more so, if you find something that's really not so much of value, you must return that too. And Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who writes a beautiful interpretation of the Talmud, he explains it is also true not only with kosher animals, but also with the donkey and even inanimate objects like a piece of clothing. I think about the lost and founds in schools, right? At the end of the year, there's an entire lost and found, and the administration usually says, if it is not picked up by a certain moment, then it's going to be gone forever. But at least the lost and found gives you a chance in order to find your belonging. Actually, it reminds me of what I'm thinking about today. As I switched offices this past year, I misplaced, and I take full blame for it, my shofar. And for the last few days, I've been looking for this shofar. I wish I could hear that shofar, but what we do with a lost object also has ethical implications of how we live our lives. And so, Rashi says, when we look at this mitzvah that I want to talk about for a few moments about building a fence around our rooftop, Rashi says it is in fact connected to the mitzvah of lost objects. And it's connected to the mitzvah of saving the child bird or the egg and letting the mother go away. Why? Because he uses the rabbinic teaching of mitzvah gorer or mitzvah, that one mitzvah leads to another mitzvah. And so if you're going to do one type of mitzvah, then the rabbis assume that that will lead you to do another type of mitzvah. One good deed leads to another, and we also know avera goreret avera, that one transgression can also easily lead to another transgression. And so, ki bayit chadash, you build a new home. Why do you have to protect your property, right? Have insurance to make sure that there's liability. The rabbis tell us also how big this fence has to be. It has to be at least 10 tefachim, which are hand breadths, or in our language, 30 inches or 75 centimeters high, 30 inches, about 2.5 feet, and strong enough not to collapse if somebody leans against it, right? It can't just be for show, but it actually has to work. And I want to just read for you in the Chumash. It says, context. These are not the homes that we have here in California or New York or in Texas or Chicago, but the homes that they're talking about during the times of the ancient Near East. It says the flat roofs of houses in the ancient Near East were regularly used for drying and storing produce, strolling and socializing, and sleeping in warm weather. We're in the midst of a heat wave here, right? And if it was hot, back in the olden days, people would go outside and sleep on their roofs. Therefore, since the roof was used for so much, people were in constant danger of falling off unless a protective barrier was there. I was just in New York City a couple of weeks ago and seeing the children, or our children seeing people's rooftops was really fascinating, because in Los Angeles, it's not often that rooftops become a place of gathering. And so we have to remember that this mitzvah is about building a roof or a fence around the roof, but not on the roofs that we have, rather the roofs that people had back in the ancient Near East. And so the rabbis have to then come up with an analogy of what this means to us today. So when we talk about building a fence on our rooftop, I want to think about this month of Elul. We're literally in the middle of the month of Elul, and we are preparing for the High Holy Days. And when we prepare for the High Holy Days, we are not building a physical fence around our homes, but we are building a metaphorical fence around our hearts. And when we think about what a fence does, a fence has two different options. A fence can keep things out that we don't want in, or a fence can keep things in that we don't want out. And those are two very different types of fences, right? If you build a fence around your property, your lawn, and you have children, you want to keep your children in, and you want to keep bad things out. It's the same fence, but it serves two very, very, very different purposes. It's interesting that Maimonides, who of course is a rabbi, but also a philosopher and a doctor, uses not this verse, but we talked about the verse before about returning a lost object, to restore one to life. That when you return a lost object, it's not just an animal or an inanimate object, but in fact, you should return somebody's life to them. And he says that somebody should render medical care to somebody when possible. And when I think about that, I also think about what it means for a fence, right? A fence returns things that you don't want to leave in, and it leaves things that you don't want out. And it has negative connotations and positive connotations. Unfortunately, we live in a world where fences are being built everywhere around properties, and to be honest, we don't know our neighbors the way that at least we used to, right? You have your property, it's only yours, whereas what I love, for instance, when you go, let's say, to Jerusalem on Shabbat, right? It's almost like a free-for-all, because as long as everybody's home at night, it's all good. I remember a friend who is not Jewish went to Israel, and at 11 p.m., there are children running around the street and said, I don't understand this. And his friend who he was with said, this is how we live here. It's a kibbutz, right? A kibbutz is about shared property, not just the physical property, but the shared community as well. And so in this month of Elul, when we talk about building a fence around the Torah, or sorry, that's my next point. When we talk about building a fence around our homes, we have to ask ourselves, are we guarding things that are within it, or are we guarding things from getting in? I think this year, post-October 7th, schools, synagogues have shifted the focus to guarding things that are in, right? We don't want to talk about bad things that are out, but we want to talk about good things that are in. But then the complication is when you go out, how do you bring what's good that's in out? Because we also live in a world of reality as well. And so how do you protect yourself while also living in this world? And I think it comes down to the mitzvah that we read a couple of weeks ago in portion of Re'eh, where we're told, Bacharta b'chaim. That means we should choose life. And so a fence allows us to choose life. I remember going to the Grand Canyon a couple of years ago, and our youngest one wanted to, it was called Bright Angel Trail. If you've been to the Grand Canyon, you can walk down, and it was daunting. We only took a few steps and we realized this is not for us. But there was no fence there. I remember a couple years ago walking across the the Golden Gate Bridge with Rabbi Guzik. There was a fence, but I don't know if it was the height of this parapet, that you also felt in danger. If you ever climb Matzada in the snake trail, also very few guardrails, right? At the same time, when you do have the extremely large guardrail, the question is how high the fence can be that you feel like you're sort of trapped inside. And so, just as everything we do within our Judaism, there is a balance. And how do we live in that sort of gray area? I want to just quote a few articles that are fascinating. This one article by Rabbi Jamie Alpert. She gave a sermon about this. It's called Building Outer Parapets and Taking Inner Fences Down, and really making that distinction between that. So, in the Talmud, we are obligated to construct a guardrail, not just around the roof, the rabbis take it further, but also around a storage pit. Why is that? Using the biblical laws as grounds to prohibit one from, for instance, raising a vicious dog or from keeping a rickety ladder that might break. Our values teach us that we must do our best to keep people protected from harm. There's a intense piece of Talmud, and it's called Bava Metzia, that talks about protections of fences everywhere. So even outside our home, there was a big sort of like hole, right? And for months we talked about, well, who's responsible for it? Every time we go out of our driveway, it would be like almost a flat tire. Finally, the city fixed it just a couple of weeks ago, but we knew it was a point of danger, not just for us, but it wasn't our property. And we thought, well, should we put something out there? Should they put something out there? Eventually, they did it. Or think of sidewalks, right? Whose property are sidewalks when it's in between my house and your house? And we know the sidewalks in our area are not the flattest sometimes. You have to be very careful where you're going. But again, that's the physical. In the spiritual business, what are the fences that we have to put around? In Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, we learn about siyag la Torah, that you should put a fence around the Torah. Putting a fence around the Torah preserves tradition, but when the fence is too high, it doesn't allow tradition and change to go together. So therefore, you'll go into specific religious communities where if the fence gets too high, it's almost stifling. But if the fence is too low, then we lose our spiritual religious tradition. I'm only putting out questions, of course, right? And so where is the perfect height for the fence? Or for instance, when we moved into our home, there was no fence in a place that our children could be harmed. And so the first thing we did, we knew that we would not move into the house until there was a fence that was allowed. It had to be higher than the children's height. Now they're taller than the fence, but able to get around okay. And in this month of Elul, right, we hear the shofar every single morning. And what do we do when we hear the shofar? We're doing what we call the cheshbon hanefesh, which means an accounting of the soul, right? We are trying to build the fence while also trying to enter the world. And this idea of cheshbon hanefesh, I think, also looks very different this year. And I go back to what I just said earlier, that tomorrow is 9/11, and each year on 9/11, I take a cheshbon hanefesh. I was in New York during that day, and remembering both the sights, the sounds, the smells, the connection with people over the many years since then. And it always happens usually in the month of Elul, right? 9/11 is this year right before Rosh Hashanah, sometimes it's in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But those moments really allowed us to say, like, what is our greater purpose? And now when you hear the stories, for instance, of survivors of 10/7, right? I just said last week, there's an entire genre of 10/7 literature happening right now. Just like we have Holocaust literature, Anne Frank, survivors, how important it is to write their testimony. You're seeing that happen in real time right now, that testimony is being written. And I believe that it is this parapet, this fence, that we who were not physically there need to know what happened, and generations later have to know what happened. And you're seeing now, for instance, the JNF event last week, that who are speaking together now? Holocaust survivors and 10/7 survivors. And they're talking about both the differences and the similarities of their experience, of the trauma, but also their speaking, their writing, their involvement in telling their stories is, I believe, the way that this fence will be created, so that, not that somebody will fall off the roof, but we use the words never again, that this cannot happen again. There's one book, it's called 100 Stories of Transformation. It's by the Haaretz journalist Lee Yaron. And she says that, like, how do we move on when we actually cannot move on? And one of those ways of not moving on but moving with is, in fact, telling these stories, and by doing so, creating that fence around us that we feel that we are part of something that we need to do as well. It's interesting, I saw there's an Instagram meme, but it's beautiful, from a religious woman in Israel, and she says, in Hebrew, there's no word for history. Say historia, but historia is not Hebrew, it's Greek. What word represents history? She says the word toldot, but we usually translate the word toldot as generations, meaning we know, we really do know, that we are living through history right now. We are part of history. We have an act to actually play in it. We're not watching somebody else. We know that our future generations will literally look back and say, what happened, what did we do, and how do we learn from that? And she said, Toldot is not history. She said there is no history in Judaism. Instead, there's only legacy. And legacy is about what part will you play in this chain of tradition. Same thing, right? We want to preserve, we want to create that fence. We want to create that parapet so that we do have an opportunity to actually be part of that as well. Again, usually this idea of making this fence around your roof is not brought to the spiritual side, but there's no better reminder right now that in this month of Elul, in this day before 9/11, in this world of post-10/7, leading up to Rosh Hashanah, to me this image of what that fence around us means is both beautiful and challenging. Beautiful and challenging, right? You don't want to lock people in. You want to be inviting, but you also want to be both, of course, physically secure, but also spiritually secure as well. And finally, I want to talk about the nofel. Because in this verse here it says, right, when you build a new house, you're going to build a fence around it. Ki ipol hanofel mimenu, so that nobody should fall from it. And the Talmud talks about the person that falls. It's not just the person that's protecting, but the person who falls. The Talmud tells us the reason he is called one who falls is because he was already destined to fall. But you don't have to be the one that makes it happen. Making the fence will ensure that it doesn't happen in your house. When something like that happens in your house, it reflects negatively on you. Again, this leaves the question, why is it called one who falls? The word in our verse that means one who falls, hanofel, doesn't refer to somebody who is destined to fall, but rather somebody who is presently falling. So it's important to make that distinction between somebody we just know is going to fall down and somebody who is presently falling. We think of a young child learning how to walk for the first time, right? They're destined to fall. When they get up on their knees for the first time, they're going to fall, right? We don't expect that from an adult who's walking down the street but who trips on the sidewalk and then falls down. Same thing spiritually. If we are destined to fall, that's different than somebody who is presently falling. And so if we are destined to fall, then how do we prevent those falls? That is what I believe ritual does, right? Not everybody feels the same spirituality when they do ritual every single time. But when we get into the practice of ritual, we know that we have the moment to feel it, right? Take Shabbat candles. If you light Shabbat candles each week, you might not feel the glory of God every single time. But we know that if we don't have Shabbat candles each week, then you don't have the opportunity to feel it when it is there. Shabbat, candles, holidays, right? If you ever have missed a ritual that you love to do, religious or not, I call it the presence of absence. When it is absence, you actually feel its presence more because you missed it, right? Again, the Shabbat candles is the easiest one, but challah for kids, you really feel it on Passover, right? That first matzah you eat, you realize, oh my gosh, that challah was so good. I want that back. That's just autobiographical right there. But the same thing is true with ritual as well. And when you look at the surge of people walking into religious institutions, specifically synagogues, after October 7th, I believe that there was a presence of absence, that we were awoken to our Jewish identity that we knew was in there, but we didn't know how to access. And so the fence has always been here, this beautiful physical space, our communities. Now when it's really needed, we're here. And what I would love to change the paradigm over this next year is that people don't walk into religious institutions for need, but we're going to walk in here for desire. Because when you change the need, if it's just for a need, then when the need is gone, then we're done. But it's for desire, that's when I believe the paradigm also changes with the fence. If it's just for need, then I'm coming in here to keep everything out. But if it's for desire, then I'm going to come in to actually keep everything in and then bring that out into the world as well. So this Shabbat, as we commemorate 9/11, I just want to dedicate this teaching to Joshua Birnbaum, who was in his 20s, who lost his life on 9/11. I never met him in person, but I was a friend of his best friend, Lehi Madelon, who was my RA that semester of 9/11. And each year I dedicate a piece of learning to Josh Birnbaum of blessed memory. And may his memory be a blessing. May all those in Israel continue to be a blessing. And may we build a beautiful fence that does both, that keeps what we don't want out, and most importantly, that keeps our community in together. We wish everybody a early, what's today, Tuesday? Sorry, I usually do Thursday. A good week, not a Shabbat Shalom yet. And we look forward to our learning together. Have a wonderful week.